But first, U.S. officials confirming that Hamas has released 2 American hostages Friday. Judith and Natalie Raanan, a mother and a daughter from suburban Chicago, are dual U.S.-Israeli citizens. They were visiting family near the Gaza border when Hamas attacked southern Israel nearly 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, satellite photos show more than 200 trucks with humanitarian aid gathering at Egypt's Rafah border crossing with Gaza in the south. That border remains closed. But President Biden says Friday he expects aid will be able to reach Gaza within the next 48 hours. We have reporters on the ground in Israel and the West Bank. We begin with Charlie D'Agata in Tel Aviv.
Judith Raanan and her 17-year-old daughter, Natalie, had come to Israel to celebrate the 85th birthday of Judith's mother. Israeli officials say they were kidnapped by Hamas gunmen from the Nahal Oz kibbutz, not more than a few hundred yards away from Gaza, during the militant group's murderous rampage on October 7th.
These 2 Americans are now safely in the hands of Israeli authorities in Israel. We welcome their release. We share in the relief that their families, friends, and loved ones are feeling. But there are still 10 additional Americans who remain unaccounted for in this conflict. We know that some of them are being held hostage by Hamas, along with an estimated 200 other hostages.
Meyer Hecht is their rabbi in Evanston, Illinois.
This news that Judith and Natalie have been released from the hands of Gaza Hamas terrorists is overwhelming. And really, we have this tremendous gratitude to God.
The breakthrough came tonight when Hamas announced it was releasing the 2 Americans on humanitarian grounds, following negotiations through Qatari mediators. Later confirmed by the Israeli Defense Forces spokesman, saying they are within the territory of Israel and in the arms of the army. U.S. officials say a small number of Americans scattered and hidden away amid catastrophic destruction and violent chaos in Gaza. Today, a symbolic ceremony was held by family members in Tel Aviv. 203 empty seats at a Shabbat dinner their loved ones may never join. Getting the hostages out alive during a major ground invasion is a challenge not seen on this scale here before.
It's a war zone.
Yeah, it's different than other hostage-taking scenario. This is a different sort of scenario. This is a war zone.
Doron Avital is the former commander of Israel's elite special forces unit, Sayeret Matkal. Extracting hostages in the middle of an active war zone is the last option.
You're going to have troops that are moving in, troops that are coming under fire. You're going to have booby traps, tunnels, snipers. And within that scenario, you're going to have
I think it's a major challenge, and a challenge that Israel never encountered in the past.
And Charlie joins us now from Tel Aviv. Charlie, what was the reason Hamas gave for releasing the Americans?
The official reason is they said they were doing it on humanitarian grounds. And furthermore, that they were hoping that this might be the start of something. And it's worth mentioning here that airstrikes stopped. We spoke to our colleagues on the ground in Gaza. The airstrike stopped from about 12:30 this afternoon, about 5 hours before the hostages were freed. And as far as we know, that hasn't resumed. So it may be a tactic that they're hoping for. And it's also worth noting that soon after the hostages were taken, there were several, quote, foreign hostages, Americans, other foreign hostages included. And Hamas said then that we never intended to take foreign hostages, that they were guests. So that may be an indication, at least on that level, Americans, there are further Americans inside Gaza, there are French, British, et cetera, that are still there. That may be an indication that they may be willing to negotiate. So it's certainly a positive step forward.
And how did the hostage release unfold?
Yeah, so we found out about it from Israeli Defense Forces, who said that they had been released. We later learned that the negotiation actually took place with the Qataris. Now, the Qataris will negotiate on behalf of the United States, partly because there are no diplomatic ties with Hamas. Hamas is considered a terrorist organization by the Americans and others. But the Qataris have been negotiating on behalf of the United States. So that part of it was done from the Qataris. As far as the actual physical handover, we understand that members of the Red Cross actually went to that border, and it happened, it's important, wasn't through Egypt, but it went through Gaza into Israel, and they are now in the hands, we understand it, of Israeli forces.
You spoke in your report with a former commander of an Israeli military unit that specializes in hostage rescue. What strategy does he think the IDF will have to use to secure the release of the hostages?
Yeah, well, this is where it gets very complicated. He has said, and generals have said, that the hostages would not serve as a sort of impediment to any ground invasion. So they're being adamant about that. But in real terms, logistically, they will have these hostage teams going in alongside invading forces if this is to happen in a major ground offensive. And individually, of course, these hostages are spread out. What they want to do is have negotiations take place. Yes, they may have to do this by force. They're going to have to use human intelligence, humans, as they say, and surveillance to figure out where these hostages are being held. But when things get as chaotic as they are going to be in a kinetic battle zone like that, with firing happening on all sides, it will be individual cases where they're going to try to negotiate with the people on the ground where these hostages are being held before they need to do it by force. Because again, this is going to be extremely dangerous, not just for the hostages themselves, but for the troops who are trying to free the hostages.
It's my experience that hostages are often separated to different locations so that the captors have more leverage in the future in case some are rescued. Charlie D'Agata, thank you for your reporting on the ground in Israel. For more on the aid heading to Gaza, as well as ongoing protests related to the war, here's Imtiaz Tyab in the West Bank.
Israeli forces mass along Gaza's northern and eastern borders as it prepares for a ground war. But along the Palestinian territory's southern front, repairs are underway at the Rafah crossing with Egypt as 90 trucks of humanitarian aid wait to get in, and foreign passport holders, including U.S. citizens, wait to get out. Gaza is in desperate need of aid, but as Israel strikes only intensify. In the south, where more than 600,000 have taken refuge, some are now leaving, saying they'd rather die in their own homes. While in the Israeli-occupied West Bank, stone-throwing Palestinians bitterly confront Israeli forces, who strike back hard. Israeli snipers shot at several protesters. We witnessed at least 3 and caught the moment one injured protester was put in an ambulance. Since Hamas's deadly rampage, 82 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank.
The fury that these protesters have isn't just at Israel and its bombardment of Gaza. It's also at President Biden, who they say is giving Israel unconditional support.
Unconditional support that has allowed Israel to kill in Gaza with impunity, say protesters in Cairo as they pour into Tahrir Square during a day of rage. There were even massive demonstrations in the war-torn capital of Yemen, Sana'a. In Turkey's largest city, Istanbul, they burnt an effigy of Israel's prime minister and the U.S. flag.
Imtiaz Tyab joins us now. Imtiaz, you're in the Israeli-occupied West Bank where tensions are high. What are the concerns there?
Well, Catherine, as you saw from our report, it is very tense on the ground. We witnessed 3 of those protesters get shot by those Israeli snipers who are just sort of up on a hilltop. And our colleagues who remained on the ground after we'd left, they saw 8 Palestinian protesters get shot. And as we've been reporting, that since Hamas's brutal attack on southern Israel here in the occupied West Bank, it's also been the scene of violence. Maybe not as extraordinary and harrowing and horrifying as what we've been seeing inside Gaza, but 82 Palestinians have been killed, mainly in confrontations with the Israeli military, but also with Jewish settlers here inside the occupied West Bank. As you know, there are many settlements here in the occupied West Bank. They're considered illegal under international law. But we have to look at politics for a moment here. Even though so much attention is being paid on the conflict that we're looking at here right now, Israel is bitterly polarized politically. This is the most extreme far-right government in its history. It has settlers who are key players in it, and they have really emboldened some of the more radical elements in that settler movement who do feel as if they have impunity, and that is really fueling a lot of the violence that we're seeing here. Catherine.
You know, we're seeing protests across the Middle East. Imtiaz, are they expected to grow in the coming days?
I think the short answer is yes. And the real fear here, Catherine, is that this protest movement that we're seeing in all of these capitals around the Middle East, something we really have not seen in a very long time, could spill over into a conflict. And if that does, we could also see the U.S. dragged into that conflict. Why would that happen? Well, we have to consider some of the players in this region. If you look north of Israel, you have Hezbollah. If you look to Syria, which Israel also has a border with, you have other factions there as well. But perhaps underneath all of that is Iran, which of course is Israel's arch rival in the region. It supports Hezbollah, it supports Hamas. And so there is this really dangerous cauldron of things that are happening here right now. And many of these armed groups, which again are not only allied with Iran, but also have aligned themselves very closely with Palestinian liberation, with the Palestinian freedom movement. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on them to respond to Israel as it continues to bomb Gaza, as that death toll continues to rise. They cannot be seen as sitting there and doing nothing. And the fear is that they will respond, and that could drag this terrible conflict in Gaza right across the region. Catherine.
Imtiaz, given the massing of troops along these borders, do you have the sense that we're right on the cusp of the ground offensive?
It feels like it. In fact, Israeli military leaders are saying so, but there are so many metrics at play here. Of course, this evening we saw these incredible images of these 2 Americans being freed from inside Gaza. There's over 200 more people inside there, including at least 10 Americans. And one would imagine that Israel really wants to get those people out. And so it becomes a very difficult thing to have your huge army go inside Gaza, and this urban warfare is going to be a very difficult fight for Israel as well. We have to remember that although we've seen repeated wars with Gaza, I think this is now the 6th one in 16 years, only twice has Israel had troops on the ground inside Gaza. But this situation is very different. We know that because Israel has announced this massive ground invasion, that Hamas has booby-trapped it, it has snipers, it will be very dangerous, very difficult terrain. And then you add on top of it the fact that there are hostages. There is a lot of calculations going on with the Israeli military as they think about moving forward into Gaza. Catherine.
Imtiaz Tyab, thank you so much for your reporting on the ground this week. The release of 2 American hostages kidnapped by Hamas was coordinated with the help of Qatar and the International Committee of the Red Cross. CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan joins us now. So, Margaret, did the U.S. government offer anything in this process to help secure these hostages?
We don't know of any direct American collateral here. What we do know is that America has been putting, through the Secretary of State, a lot of diplomatic pressure on Qatar to deliver. And they were able to deliver these 2 Americans through the direct negotiation with Hamas. Now, Qatar does have leverage over Hamas. It is that Gulf state that helps in many ways to deliver in aid, to fund, and to help finance many basic services within the Gaza Strip. So it is not clear that they threatened to withhold anything, but there is a lot of diplomatic pressure that Qatar can bring to bear here. And at least in this case of these 2 Americans, what diplomatic pressure they exerted did pay off. But there are hundreds that are still held. So the diplomats that I'm speaking to here and abroad are saying they just want to make the most of this opportunity. They think they have proof of concept, and they want to try to replicate it.
Well, thank goodness these 2 people are out this evening. But I'm glad that you mentioned the couple of hundred that are left. This administration has had a policy of prisoner swaps or hostage swaps. That's been a real departure, as you know, from other administrations. Do you think that's complicated the efforts to free the remaining Americans in Gaza?
Well, hostage diplomacy is always fascinating to me, and it's a little bit different in each case. And in this case, it was very different because the president really showed a direct interest, very publicly, broadcast it, which is not something they normally do. Typically, the excuse for the president not meeting with hostage families is that it would make it harder to get their release.
Right, sort of elevate their currency,
exactly,
really.
Put a greater price on their head. In this case, he went all in and emphasized that this was a top priority. So there was a different dynamic in this negotiation than in others, I would say. In the case, though, that you bring up a really important point is that in these swaps or releases, there's always some cost. And I thought it was fascinating to look earlier in the week at an announcement by the IDF, the Israeli military, that one of the targets they took out was a Hamas leader who they believe was involved in planning the attack on Israel, who had once been in jail in Israel and was released as part of a big prisoner swap.
Right,
because countries like Israel and the United States say to their nationals that we have a duty to bring you home and we'll bring you home at any price. Not all countries do that. And so it's always interesting to look at what is the price and how do you put a value on an American life versus an Israeli life versus another. And these two countries have decided it is worth making some of these trade-offs.
Well, we'll learn so much more, right?
We
in
will.
the coming weeks. Margaret Brennan, thank you.